Okay, thanks everyone for being with us and listening to this presentation from the industry. As the next step, I'll go back to the presentation and provide the update on our proposed changes, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm going to share my screen again.
Looks great.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll start with a little bit of context. So first off, we have talked about this quite a bit. Why should we address embodied carbon now? Embodied carbon emissions are significant. So the graph on the left shows global GHG emissions. And as you can see, there is the 7% that's highlighted is building embodied carbon emission. The darker blue is buildings operations, which is 18%. And then as you can see on the bottom, the infrastructure materials are about 10%. So relatively buildings and infrastructure have similar embodied carbon emissions on a global scale. And the graph on the right is Canada infrastructure investment. So it's spending, not GHG emissions, but this can be a good way to estimate the spending on materials. So you can see the two highlighted ones are spendings on buildings in Canada, and the other ones are infrastructure. Again, in Canada, spendings on buildings are even more significant. But again, this is dollar value. So and then for Vancouver itself, we note that we estimate embodied carbon to be around 180 tons of CO2 per year, which is about 13% of our total operational emissions from new and existing buildings. And just to add up, another study by Preopta for BC estimated embodied carbon for new buildings to be on the scale of 3.9 megatons of CO2 annually, which is close to 50% of all operational emissions in BC, and that's only including structure and envelope. If other elements like interior, MEP, and refrigerants are added, the amount goes up to, the estimate is 8.3, which is about 85%. So again, the emissions are significant, and as we have maybe said it quite a bit, it's upfront, it's happening now. For Vancouver, as part of our climate emergency action plan, we identified 6 big moves to hit our climate targets. And big move 5 is low carbon materials and construction practices, which set the targets to reduce embodied carbon from new buildings by 40% by 2030 relative to a 2018 baseline or start. We also release our embodied carbon strategy at the same time, which identifies our key actions, which works hand in hand. The first one, which is the focus of today, is changing the rules. So that would be through our Vancouver Building By-law to set embodied carbon reporting and reduction requirements. But we also, at the same time, we are working on changing the market through removing barriers and providing incentives. We also work to change the culture, so build capacity and help industry transformation, and change the context, so essentially aligning with other actions. An example of that is the removal of minimum parkade, which Vancouver recently did. So going to the bylaw changes, back in 2022, we brought to council two sets of proposal, one to become effective 2023, which is what is currently in place now, and then a proposed changes for 2025, which were approved in principle, but we were going to go back to council with updates, which is what we are consulting on right now. So again, what is in place right now for all Part 3 new buildings, which excludes smaller buildings like Part 9 buildings, is to report embodied carbon emissions and also set a limit of double of a baseline. To be able to implement this, we also develop a set of embodied carbon guidelines, which basically sets the compliance path. So what we mean by less of the double of that baseline. So what's that baseline? And also to standardize modeling to make sure that embodied carbon assessments are as comparable as possible. We also standardize reporting through creating an Excel sheet. We call it embodied carbon design report, and also another complementary documentation requirements, again, to make sure that we are simplifying the review process, simplifying the submission process, and getting sufficient data. We also have been working with other policy leaders in the country. So and just to make sure that we are aligning as much as possible. So a quite significant update is that National Research Council of Canada, NRC, adopted our embodied carbon guidelines with some changes to be used for federally owned buildings, but also encouraged other jurisdictions to use the same. So we all are aligning in that. And Canada Green Building Council Zero Carbon Building Standard also is referring to these national guidelines. So again, making sure that we can move together and simplifying it also for the industry in different jurisdictions. So moving to our proposed changes for coming up 2025, as I mentioned, back in 2022, we had a set of recommendations, which was basically reduction of 20% for lower rise buildings that can be built with wood and 10% for the rest. And then a set of responsible material criteria, which projects could choose to meet or double the reduction requirements. And those responsible material criteria included things like recycling or reuse or certified sustainable materials and so on. However, in consultation with the industry, we simplified and maybe reduced the reduction requirement quite a bit to make sure that we are working with industry capacity. So what we are proposing now, which we, again is now open for public review and also will take to council later on, is to first exempt smaller projects. These are basically projects that are smaller than 1,800 square meter, which is essentially the size of a Part 9 building, but when they're allocated to be Part 3. Again, just so that we make sure that it is manageable for project size. And then we are keeping the whole building LCA reporting or embodied carbon reporting, and then set a limit of 10% across the line. This 10%, minimum 5% of it should be achieved through actual reduction, and then up to 5% of it can be achieved through voluntary reporting, which we call a set of voluntary reporting, which we call them industry leadership credits. Yeah, that's that for now. So what we understood in working with the industry is that 5 to 10% reduction can be achieved at no to minimal cost and scheduling implications. So solutions that we have seen, so a lot of the wood, either stick build or mass timber projects tend to get there using low carbon concrete. So for example, using GUL cement, which is actually a common practice in BC, can get used some way there, and lower carbon installations, again, that are available and common in the industry. And also through design efficiency and reducing redundancies, which we heard a few of the examples in the presentations we just heard. And then less common, but also solutions we have seen, again, mass timber construction, and then also reusing of existing buildings on site. And again, we have allowed that up to 5% industry leadership credit in case projects cannot achieve the whole 10%. And then we also have the last piece that for unforeseen circumstances, projects can are allowed to achieve reduction to the satisfaction of the chief building official. So we also, again, I mentioned that we have this embodied carbon guidelines, which sets our compliance path. So we have two pathways currently on the guideline. Projects can either set and meet an absolute limit. So basically that's an embodied carbon intensity per square meter, or achieve a percentage reduction relative to an equivalent baseline. And how to define that baseline is detailed in our guidelines. So for absolute path, we currently have only one single number. So our benchmark is 400. And when we say minimum 5% reduction, that will be 380. And if they want to achieve the whole 10%, that will be 360. And again, so just I'm showing some of the results from our project submissions. So the gray ones on the left are rezoning applications from 2017 to now, and the green ones are building permits that we have received. So some of these building permits are submitted prior to the VBBL, and this is through rezoning. So buildings that have submitted their embodied carbon in rezoning are required to submit in BP. So just to show that quite a bit of projects, low-rise wood buildings and high-rise wood, are achieving or are below that absolute path. But then there are some projects that are above it, which they can go through the baseline path. So for the baseline path, we heard an example of a project from the GF that I'm just showing some images from there. There's a case study on that you can look into it more in depth. But what we have seen commonly with projects that go through relative reduction is to use design efficiency and reducing parkade, which can go in this about 10% reduction. Also, again, using low carbon concrete and insulation. So using GUL cement, for example, instead of GU cement. And then wood construction typically achieves around 20% reduction. And then I mentioned the industry leadership credits. So basically that is voluntary reporting of 4 categories. One is reporting building elements that are currently optional. So I'll get a bit more into that later on. The other one is project-specific construction emissions, so A4 and A5. And in the presentation of Elistan, we heard that these emissions are expected to be higher than what tools report. And so we value getting more data on that and identifying reduction opportunities there. So here, just by reporting it, projects can get up to 3%. So one is for removal of the existing building, the other one is for construction site emission, and the last is waste from construction. The third category is circularity practices. So that essentially includes salvaging from the existing building, even if the elements are not reused on the same site, and then design for the construction. And lastly, use projects with sustainability, transparency, or health certifications. These are similar to what, for example, LEED has on materials, for example, certified wood or healthy materials, health product declaration. So just to show a bit more on the first one, optional building elements. So projects can get 1% addition per additional element category. So right now, we only mandate structure and envelope. So for example, the screenshot on the right shows elements. You don't have to see the details, but essentially it's showing interior construction, and the rows that are colored in darker, like brown, are optional, but if they're included, that would be an additional point for interior construction. And all these sub elements can have that with reporting the bigger category. So just quickly touching on what we have heard so far, essentially what we understand is that the industry wants the code to remain simple and avoid complications on this scope. We looked into providing prescriptive pathways, but what we understood is that the current approach covers that. So as I showed, for example, a lot of the wood buildings that tend to achieve the reduction requirements can show it by the whole building LCA reporting. And also what we heard is that the industry doesn't want us to provide prescriptive pathways that may have unintended consequences and may not meet the requirement because of some other choices. And then supporting the industry capacity and providing clear guidance, which is much needed, and we're working with the industry to do that. And then also requiring whole building LCA data. And on that, essentially, why we continue to require whole building LCA on projects is that, first of all, what we have seen in the industry is that by just doing whole building LCA, by having a modeler, a lot of opportunities are identified at low to no cost, which may not have been seen just because it wasn't a factor before. Also, through this whole building approach, we are giving credit to efficiency and not just choice of low carbon materials. So, for example, we saw examples of the efficiency, and also, again, like reuse is another one that may not be captured just by asking for low carbon materials. And then also it sets the industry to prepare for future reduction steps. And lastly, this data is crucial for us for next steps of policy and regulation, including setting reduction targets. What we have seen so far from industry leaders, so these are some case studies that are actually available, and we could share the links later on. So the one on the top left is 365 Railway Street, which is on path to achieve 45% reduction through reuse, mass timber structure, and using lower carbon concrete and insulation. The one on the bottom, Marple Community Center, is on the path to achieve 40% reduction. Again, well, this one is through reducing parquet, mass timber, and lower carbon and insulation. And the one on the top right is what ZGF presented, or we shared the presentation of ZGF. So essentially, it's achieved 22% reduction by reducing parquet and again, lower carbon insulation and concrete, but still common practice products. So what we are just going to do as our next step. So we will refine our absolute benchmarks. So we intend to study that more and make it more specific to typologies. Improving our compliance process. So we are hopefully looking into making some of the submission and review online to make sure that it's more smooth and more efficient. Continue to build industry capacity. And in terms of expanding the code, we are looking into potential prescriptive compliance pathways more for smaller buildings like Part 9 buildings. We're exploring, again, this is just looking at it at this time to look into some elements that are proven based on studies to be significant, like interior MEP, and then also enabling more application of mass timber. This is it for my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh, actually I did. And then allow some time for questions. I see Yuri, you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute? And
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing presentation, very efficient. Thank you. 2 questions. What are the next steps? You see, next, what's going to happen in 5 years in your mind? And second question, is there conversation in promoting higher reduction, significantly higher reduction, 20, 30, 40%, by suggesting express pathway for, let's say, building permit application or other applications within the city?
I can take the first part of that if you like, Zara. So just in a nutshell, next steps include what Zara just showed about improving implementation and exploring expansion. Those are covered by a Codes Acceleration Fund grant that the city got of nearly $2 million to work and help advance codes, both implementation and developing new regulations. So we will be covered under that grant. We'll be doing that work. We've also got direction from council to develop the next phase of our climate action plans that will cover us through the next 5 years through till 2030. But the original embodied carbon strategy was intended to take us, showed some steps through to 2030, including those, looking at what can we do for Part 9 buildings and smaller buildings. Are there other types of materials and scopes that we can include in our calculations, things like that. And then, what does that schedule of next steps look like in like 2027, or how do we get to that 40% reduction in 2030? That can be part of that research and part of that next step in the climate plan.
Zara, if it's okay, I can speak to the second part of that question. Yeah, we have begun to look at, are there tools the city has to incent higher reductions now to accelerate that learning to get to 40% by 2030? We've just begun that work, but it is on our radar and we are looking for those opportunities and tools.
I can just comment on that. That would be quite a really good tool to have. It would be the first tool for us to convince the clients to target those higher reductions.
For sure. Brenda, I see your hand is raised.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you for the presentation. I have a question about the industry leadership credits and whether or not there are thresholds set, for example, for the salvage of the existing buildings on site, as well as the design for deconstruction or disassembly of the new buildings.
Yeah, great question. I also see two questions in writing. One is asking about when those details will be available, and also the version 2 of our guidelines. So kind of that's combined. So actually, some of the details of these industry leadership credits, we are still working on it, including salvaging and the design for deconstruction. So the more details will become available in our guidelines, which will be released before the effective date of the code. And in terms of will there be a limit set, I cannot say exactly what we're going to do, but one option is to actually provide that credit through assuming the reduction from the quantity that is actually salvaged. But if you're going to give that 1%, then yes, there will be a minimum to make sure that a reasonable amount of material is salvaged. But again, the details of that is not finalized yet, and we're still working through them.
Thank you.
Amy, I see you have your hands raised.
Hiya, just two questions. One, when are these being enforced? I remember it being January 2025, and just wondered if it's that's still the case. And then you talked about an 800 maximum limit. Is that for your baseline LCA if you're going down the percentage reduction pathway? And where is that written? I saw an 800 cap on some of your graphs.
The 800 cap is what is in place for 2023 now. But we haven't set a cap if a baseline path is to be used.
Yeah, so that's just for the absolute path. Would you take the baseline or benchmark of 400 and double it, because we have 100%, you can't be more than 100% above the baseline. But that's just for the absolute path. In the baseline path, there is no cap. And as for the effective date, it would be the same. We're bringing it as part of the update, part of the next version of the Vancouver Building By-law. So it'd be the same effective date as the new VBBL. My understanding of the working date is March 2025, but that could change depending on when the bylaw's effective date is. So I don't expect it to be any sooner than that. One other question, Zara, I saw in the chat was, do we know if BC or other provinces or cities intend to implement the 2024 International Building Code, IBC's Green Construction Code? Have you heard anything about that?
I actually don't know the answer to that.
I haven't heard anything about adoption of the IBC Green Construction Code in Canada. But love to hear more about that, perhaps offline. Would be great. Lyle?
Just a little more information about those industry leadership credits. First off, I think they're fantastic. As part of a mechanical and electrical engineering firm, we're invested in the MEP 2040 initiative, and we know there's a lot of work to be done in that area. Similar to the question that Brenda asked, have you thought about thresholds for MEP? Specifically, like for example, you identified a 1% credit for HVAC systems. Currently, there's a lack of information available. There's a lack of product disclosures for most products in the industry. Have you thought about thresholds to achieve that 1%?
So sorry if it wasn't as clear. What we are giving credit for is just for reporting. At this time, we do not ask for reduction to give that credit. So as you said, because we do know it's valuable to put time and actually do those assessments, right now we basically say if you do your HVAC embodied carbon reporting, you'll get a 1% reduction. However, setting the baseline and reducing from it, because we don't have sufficient data, we aren't providing that. But if a project chooses to go with the baseline path, and if they set a baseline and they show reduction for the elements, they can get credit for that reduction, but that's optional. So the way our reporting works is that you can just report it and not include it in your reduction, or you can report it and include it in your reduction. So if you have achieved reduction, you will get the credit for that, but the baseline should be set by the industry experts, because again, there's no set that we can baseline that we can refer to. So that is not included in our absolute path. Essentially, our absolute path only includes envelope and structure.
I think what we're seeing right now is that it's difficult to establish a credible baseline for MEP systems because of the lack of environmental product disclosures for the majority of the materials. And what we're finding is that we're actually it's easier for us to demonstrate reductions in embodied carbon through case studies. So for example, if we were to, replace copper bus duct with aluminum bus duct, there's a certain embodied carbon savings or things like that. Is that something that you would be open to?
So one thing
that's Patrick.
I just want to say that lack of data is exactly one of the reasons we want to incentivize folks through this credit to give us what you got, and we can set out more detail in terms of like what that reporting looks like. We'll be specifying that. I do want to just quickly note we are at time, and I really thank everybody for coming out. Zara and I are happy to stick around for a few minutes and answer any further questions, but if anyone has to go, really appreciate it. And thanks so much, Zara, for the wonderful presentation. We put some links in the chat to comment on the code, as well as resources from CLFPC. But we're happy to, for say another 10 minutes, we're happy to stick around and take further questions.
So Patrick, thank you for that comment. We're a little passionate about MEP, embodied carbon, so I don't want to derail the entire session and carry on talking about that. If it makes more sense to carry that conversation on offline, that's fine. I think what I understood from your last statement, though, is that you're open to projects taking initiatives to provide more information in this area that currently lacks information.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Zara.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just wanted to say that, yes, what we are asking is reporting. You do not basically need to show reduction. As you said, it's not as easy. So, and we can continue the chat offline if you would like to, for sure. Yuri, I see your hand. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like the updated stipulations are a little bit of a step back from what was initially proposed, right? Just curious if you're open to share. Well, why did that happen? Was it a feedback from the industry or something that you reevaluate looking at case studies? You know, it was very exciting to see what was initially proposed, and it seems very doable in a lot of cases. Yeah, just curious to learn more. Why do you have to scale back?
I can speak a little bit to that, Zara, and then you can add to it if you like. I think overall what we heard is to keep it simple where possible. We're maintaining that 10% reduction that we had originally proposed, but keeping it simple and just having that as rather than having kind of two thresholds and this and that, while also still trying to incentivize getting that additional data and that industry leadership. We also heard it can be a challenging time to develop buildings right now between rising interest rates, different changes in regulation, whether that's housing regulations or other. So we understand that. And I think most importantly, this is a framework that where we want to walk before we can run. And if we can show that this works and this is an effective way and a robust way of regulating embodied carbon, then that enables us to take steps in the future to further require reductions. But we got to prove it out first. And so, but if we're able to do that, and then I think we could, and there is a lot of potential for reductions, as you saw. Some buildings are doing 40% reductions with no incremental cost. So we're going to gain a lot of those case studies and experience quite quickly here. And then I think we'll gain a lot of confidence with doing these reductions and demonstrating those reductions. And then hopefully we'll be able to continue to move quickly. And I still have full confidence that we'll be able to get to that 40% reduction by 2030 target or even exceed it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think you covered it, Patrick. And I see Genevieve hand raised. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Hi there.
Hi.
I made two comments in the chat, and the first one was about RICS and their valuation methodology, the Red Book methodology. So I went to MIPIM over in Europe, and then I was at events in New York and then also in Switzerland. One of the cities that I'm seeing that's doing kind of the most advanced stuff in this space next to Vancouver is Zurich. So I think it would be great to schedule a call with them to learn what they're doing. But separately, the RICS Red Book methodology is the new valuation methodology that's going to be used for sustainable and green construction. There's also the ULI sea change methodology, but the thing about the RICS Red Book methodology is that it sits underneath the international valuation standards. So it just has the authority, and you'll see that over in Europe, in Asia, Latin America even, they are the big REITs and big asset managers and banks are kind of getting behind it. So it's important to kind of think about how all of the constituents are going to underwrite this, whether it be a bank, an insurer, or anything like that relative to this valuation methodology. And then next, the international building codes that I brought up, so the energy code and then the green construction code, it's really important to understand how that stacks up relative towards your code, right? Especially considering the fact that the Canadian government is getting behind it, right? Because we want for Canada to stack up with international countries because people own real estate across borders. They insure real estate across borders. There's debt and it happens across borders. And the way that we encourage international investment is by making it easy to do business in Canada. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there and kind of spread that knowledge so that you're aware of it and you kind of can understand the methodology or the logic behind what I was saying in the chat to give you a little bit more background.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. It's definitely very valuable. We have looked into the risk guidelines. I know they had released a recent one. I don't think I've seen the Red Book specifically, but we actually have had conversations with them. So you're right in that we have to learn, and definitely all great recommendations to have a chat with other cities in Europe, given that they're a few years ahead of us. One thing I would say is that our guidelines are developed to look at it practically more than holistically and accurately. So we are trying to minimize the amount of work on the design team where the data is not theirs to collect. And some of these guidelines are just focused on the ideal scenario to get the best data, which may not be feasible. But definitely we will make sure that we will follow the leadership there and make sure that we align with them as much as possible. Thank you.
It's important to understand that. It's also important to understand what they're doing for EPDs. So I get it if, Vancouver, Canada's approach is supposed to be more practical, but then you cannot create software solutions and then sustainable financial products that then align with it, right? So if I have a sustainability link loan or a sustainability link bond, I want to attach that to an equal building code because I understand that the value of risk has been mitigated at an equal value. Right. So I would attach a similar risk percentage on the loan, in accordance with the different standards. So I get it. Like you want to be more practical, but at the same time, it slows down our ability to move forward because we can't create technology that goes across borders. Right. And we can't leverage the knowledge across borders.
Well, thanks for sharing. I think you're right. A lot of valuable points to consider as we move forward with our policies and regulations. Thank you.
That sounds like something that could be beneficial in our coordination with the NRC, the National Research Council, as we coordinate on our further work on this file. Thanks so much, Genevieve.
Brenda.
Thanks again. I'm wondering if there's any other regulations that would incentivize keeping existing buildings. So this slightly incentivizes it. Is there anything else the City of Vancouver is doing to help with encouraging retrofits over demolition and new construction?
One thing I can mention, in addition to the fact that in addition to the industry leadership credits in the embodied carbon guidelines, we also, of course, give credit for retention and reuse of building materials. So that material counts towards, or reuse of that material counts towards as a benefit towards your embodied carbon targets. Another thing, we have our green demolition bylaw, which I'm sure you're familiar with. That speaks to construction waste diversion and disassembly of our oldest homes. I don't have anything to add in terms of further efforts, but I think maybe Zara, I don't know if you've been talking with our zero waste colleagues more about that.
Well, I do know that they are going through a review and update of the Green Demo bylaw. So there may be some expansion or some changes, maybe just in terms of the year the projects are, like the year the house is built. But again, in terms of the industry leadership credit and in the embodied carbon, for now, this is only 2. But yeah, I also cannot think of any additional thing. What I would say is that we are giving also, again, so for the construction site emission, one stage of it is removal of the existing building and one stage is construction. So the removal of the existing building data collection will get a credit. So we're proposing that. So essentially, that's another way to shine some light on the variations and differences and improve the data on that area as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Brenda. Thanks so much, everyone, for sticking around and for all of your questions. We can provide our contact information if you want to follow up with either of us for further questions and talk about this. Again, just remind folks that we have that invitation to comment on the bylaw changes is open until September 27th, I believe. And I will put the link again in the chat for that. And thanks so much for your time today. Really so glad to be able to share this with you, and look forward to engaging with everyone going forward as well on this.